Thank you, Dr. David Contasta, for introducing Dr. Yamaguchi this evening. I think it's really wonderful that at CHC our faculty works so closely across disciplines. And you and I have taught a course about literature and nature and history, and you've done a lot of research and writing and teaching about some of these issues, and in fact have your own book on Darwin and essays on Rachel Carson as well. So thank you so much for doing this introduction.
Thank you, Dr. McCarthy. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Hilton Yamaguchi. He earned a PhD in biology from the University of California at Los Angeles and a Master of Science in Ecology from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Since 2019, Dr. Yamaguchi has taught ecology and evolutionary biology at Chestnut Hill College. He is also the author of a half dozen peer-reviewed publications and has given numerous presentations for various university and scholarly societies. A native of Brazil, Professor Yamaguchi is fluent in Portuguese, French, Spanish, and English, and in addition has a basic knowledge of Japanese, and I can only say wow to that. We're privileged to have Dr. Yamaguchi on our faculty at Chestnut Hill College and delighted at his presentation this evening. Take it away, Dr. Yamaguchi.
About this story. And later on, I learned about Rachel Carson, and then I made the connection, right? Like oh my gosh, she influenced even this environmental movement in Brazil, and I want to share those experiences that I have. Anyways, so I'm gonna also add Wallace, because at the end, Darwin and Wallace independently came with the same idea of evolution by natural selection. Darwin probably came up with the idea first, but in the beginning I thought that he was kind of lazy because it took like more than 20 years for him to publish the Origin of Species, right? But actually it was because Wallace, well, there are like several reasons, and I'm gonna show why. But anyways, I want to just also to remind that Wallace came up with this idea. I'm more empathetic with Wallace for the fact that he was a collector. He didn't come from a rich family, and he was more like on the ground guy that was really trying to collect specimens to basically sell for collectors, right? Anyways, and later on, Richard Carson, who really, these guys, they ignited like several fields in the knowledge of like science, humanity, literature. Like it's so many different areas that they contributed that I feel very humbled, and I'm still learning about them, right? Like I spent 6 years of my life doing my PhD in between Amazon and the Brazilian savannah, basically investigating the idea about natural selection in populations of frogs, right? And still I feel that I don't know anything about like those organisms in Brazil. Anyways, again, these people, they influenced Darwin and Wallace founded like basically the modern evolutionary biology, right? Like Rachel Carson really ignited the environmental movement, and they put some momentum in the ecology field too. And I just want to like share my inspiration that I had with them, right? And first I'm gonna just show the outline here. So I'm gonna show the current situation, especially in Brazil, where I'm from. Then the 3 lessons that I got from them, right? Like instead of trying to give all the details about them, probably gonna miss a lot of details, and I still need to learn from the different fields in science and humanities, right? Like, so instead of doing that, I'm gonna just stick with these 3 lessons that I have. First, their passion for nature. Second, their ethical responsibility to share the knowledge, and once they knew about the facts in different time in history, right, the duty to act. And then I'm gonna go back to the current moment and just tell a little bit like what can we do, right? So you guys, one of the surveys that they put out there is like, what's evolution, right? The theory of evolution. Why it's so controversial? Even after more than 150 years, why it matters? Like, why do we have so many conflicts? Anybody like want to share your thoughts? And what do you think about this figure? Yeah, that's the question, right? Like, why is it so controversial? I really don't get it. Still don't get it. Like,
Anybody want to answer?
And let's provoke a little bit more, right? Like, because this idea of evolution by natural selection, right? Somebody comment that makes people feel dehumanized. That's true. It's like you feel that like we are equal as a bacteria, right? And again, let's just provoke a little bit more. And just imagine there is conflict with the religious beliefs in the beginning, for sure, right? And if you think about like it's a branch of Darwin's idea that probably he would disagree completely. That's about the social Darwinism that I don't know much, but led to these differences in race, right? Like, so imagine, for instance, that if you apply this theory of evolution in humans, on the right side you have, I don't like to make this comparison, right? I even feel bad talking about that, right? On the right side, like if you have a white person, on the left side you have like an Asian person. That means that mean that Asian are less evolved, or like a black person, right? Like, so created like these ideas that it really doesn't reflect the idea of evolution by natural selection, right? Anyways, I'm gonna give the biological perspective. And yeah, sometimes like, what's the definition of evolution? Sometimes evolution sucks, right? Like, so we have like those dinosaurs when you go to the natural history museums. Well, one branch of the dinosaurs are birds, right? Like when you're in your dinner eating chicken, for a long time I mean, I'm avoiding meat, but I'm not vegetarian, but I'm really avoiding meat. But anyways, you're eating a dinosaur, right? Like, so how do you define evolution? Is basically descent with modification, right? And when I say just descent with modification, or in the modern version, the changes of allele frequency over time, there's a lot of meaning behind of that. It's like, and if you just say those words, it might not mean anything to you, right? But for me, it does. And anyways, there's a lot of conflicts, especially in the beginning, because Darwin, there are some people saying about like the challenge about the creation, right? Like he had to challenge the society with his ideas, because there was this idea that the species didn't change over time. And they're gonna go more about those challenges that he faced to publish his ideas, right? Anyways, nowadays that's the phylogeny that we get, right? Like from his ideas. So yes, we are close related to bonobos and chimps. So here we have the current distribution of all the great apes. There is like a small portion of the chimps and bonobos distributed in the Congo Basin. Then, well, the gorillas and the two different species of gorillas over there, and the main division that they have is due to the Congo River, right? And some of those apes also in Southeast Asia. Anyways, and then you look at this phylogeny, and it's like, wow, here's the human as another species on Earth. And then if you say that like humans, we share like 99% of the DNA with bonobos and chimps, people get a little bit shocked, right? And then looking humans like as a species, right? Like we originated like in Africa about between 300 and 200,000 of years ago. And then we start migrating, right? Like we start expanding our population in currently like Europe, like and Asia, right? And the interesting things that's like in green here, you see the distribution of the Neanderthals.
Hilton,
right?
sorry, you haven't shared your screen yet.
Oh, I haven't shared my screen. So before, I just want to show here, I like these pictures. That's the picture that I wanted to show. Sorry, just going back about like on the figure here on the right side, you have like these different species, and then here's the trend towards a perfect form, right? And again, it's the wrong idea, right? Like sometimes, again, when I was talking about the chickens, the dinosaurs were like evolving from that's a branch that we have. And here's like humans, right? Like humans, we are close related to bonobos. Anyway, sorry to just go back a little bit, just for you guys to visualize a little bit about this idea of the current great apes. And here's we expand our distribution, right? And people get a little bit offended knowing for the fact that we are like in the same level of other primates. But now, due to the discoveries or like the spread of these ideas about the evolutionary processes, we can talk about these things, right? Like, and here's are the routes of human migration, and you have the overlap here in Europe about 50,000 of years ago. The overlap between humans expanding our distribution. We encountered the Neanderthals, and once we encountered the Neanderthals, we mixed with them about like between 50 to 40,000 of years ago. And I was curious about those facts, and I sent my DNA for genotyping. And it showed up that the 2 to 3% of my DNA is from the Neanderthals. And I was a little bit puzzled with this idea, right? Like, but again, we evolve, right? Like, and these routes, again, in science, there were a lot of different migrations that were proposed by different scientists. And that's okay to eventually change in the future if you have more support towards a different hypothesis, right? Like that's how we advance knowledge. And that's basically our current knowledge. And now that's when natural history of humans, we expand our distribution everywhere on this earth. And we start like this era of the Anthropocene, where we start like the human history, right? It's kind of hard for me to follow the chat and at the same time look at my screen.
Yeah, but don't worry about it. We can always come back to it.
It sounds good. Anyways, we are here in the 6th mass extinction with the expansion of humans, right? Like on Earth. And we already faced like the 5 mass extinctions that already happened. But this one is caused by humans, and this is happening in a very short period of time. There are researchers that disagree with, but anyways, there is a lot of environmental issues happening. Here is some news that I got from Brazil recently. This is from 2000, was published in 2016. And this is like one of the media that is mainstream media that we get from Brazil. And it's saying that like actually DDT, we are missing DDT. And actually in the US, DDT was banned in 1972, especially because of Rachel Carson after she published the Silent Spring, right? And imagine that it took several decades for Brazil to take some action. And it was banned in 1998, but actually they were still allowed to use in a smaller scale, and basically was banned in 2009 with legislation, right? And in this graph here, it's showing that actually after they banned for agriculture use in 1998, the number of people start dying because of malaria and yellow fever. And that's one question that I want to ask you guys, right? Like, I think I'm gonna put in the chat, right? At the same time, with human technology, right? We create these kind of pesticides for our benefit, right? Like for us to have a better survival or better lifestyle. And for instance, when we had the outbreak of Zika in Brazil, people just want to solve that problem quite fast, right? Like you just fumigate out this DDT and that's it. But again, even after decades of having so much information of the effects of pesticide, they still come up with this idea. And it's really sad once you accumulate knowledge and people do not use towards like our benefit, right? And it's the same thing about like, well, in this current situation, we think that this vaccine is going to solve our problems, right? It's like we still need to use the method that we used like in the beginning of last century, that's basically using masks and washing hands, right? Like there's not a better solution nowadays. Anyways, so that being said, right, like that time, that was still when I was in Brazil, and when I was like going to the beach, I saw those trucks fumigating DDT, and I kind of remember like my parents saying to not get close. And I remember studying vaguely about the effects in birds population, in the eggs of birds, but I had no clue that was actually Rachel that spread this environmental movement towards this pesticide, right? Anyways, other environmental issues, right? Like we have more extreme weathers happening. And when you look at in Brazil or in California too, right? Like in the Pantanal area, Pantanal is like the wetlands, which is weird thinking that like the wetlands are on fire, right? That's like a recent news that happened this past summer. And you see all these sad stories, right, in these regions. So again, I grew up here in the south of Brazil, right? Like, and we have these regions on the map are the hotspots that were defined by Myers, like in 1980s. That time there were like just 25 hotspots, biodiversity hotspots, and now we have about 35, 36. And those are regions where you have a high number of endemic species. Endemic species are species that occur just in that geographic location. And it is a region, for instance, in the Atlantic rainforest where it lost more than 70% of the natural vegetation, right? So it's a place where there is high threat, and at the same time you have high concentration of different species in that place. So since we don't have enough funding to buy land, where would you invest your money to buy land and conserve species? So those are the areas that you should put the funding in, right? Like, so this is the idea that came up with Myers in 1980, and then anyways, it really ignited another movement to preserve land, right? Anyways, why I'm saying so much about Brazil, because I am from Brazil, and that's how I inspired like to come here. I went to all these different places during my undergrad. Was really nice of my mentors taking me to these islands, and it was really cool to just explore nature. Right? At the time, we were like looking out these endemic species in this. It's called Alcatrazes, Ilha de Alcatrazes. There's like a lot of those endemic species, and this one here was really cool to learn when we visit this land. This is a picture that actually was the picture for the description of this species of frogs, Cyclohanthes, and actually the male has the parental care. So he's holding the eggs, right? And those are like, these are species of lancehead snake also is endemic and occur just in this island. And here's like a natural history observation that I have also to publish. And it was really cool to just explore. And the sad things that the military, they do those training, like they shoot like from those ships, like on those rocks, right? And they have actually painted like targets in these places. Anyways, so this is like a place where once these species go extinct, it's not going to appear again, right? Like it's extincted forever. And again, that was my work in Brazil, like exploring nature and taking these pictures and publishing this kind of work. And again, this is lesson number one, right? Like Darwin did the same thing. And those islands, when I visit those islands, well, I was start like thinking about what are the processes that lead to this high diversity, right? And then I start like, wow, Darwin had that idea. And then I start like thinking more about going to grad school. So from there, I applied to grad school in the US. And if it was probably not his idea, I wouldn't be here, right? Like it was like those kind of things that was really inspiring. And one of the things that he did, imagine like spending 5 years on a boat, traveling in these different places and collecting specimens, right? Like, and actually he was seasick most of the time. And even when he got to the Galapagos, he was, from the readings that I saw, he was like really exhausted, right? And he was collecting a bunch of things, and he was just amazed with this diversity of life, right? So this trip took 5 years. He went back and became like a prestigious and renowned naturalist. But in the back of his mind, he already made observations. So imagine that before he took that trip, he had certain beliefs about God creation and about that the Earth was just 6,000 years old, about that the species didn't change over time. But there were few researchers, especially in the paleontology or geology, right? Like already showing that the Earth was older than 6,000 of years, and that things changed over time. Anyways, I'm not going to go into the details. And here's the first lesson, right? Like about Darwin. He had admiration and respect for nature, and that's how he really inspired. And Rachel Carson, if you read it, is very poetic, right? Like she has this interconnection with nature, and she had a lot of respect and understanding the history of Earth, the relationship between the living, the biotic and abiotic things, right? Like, and that both of them, they really understood and respect these moral and aesthetic values of nature, right? They understood that it took millions of years for those species to evolve. And I think one of the passage, I don't remember exactly when, she's saying like, wow, we're going to be another species, we're going to go away, and the Earth is going to keep going, right? And again, we are like one of them, and all of us, we survived until now, so we're not more evolved than the other species, right? And now from this lesson, the lesson 2, right? This basically the ethical responsibility to share knowledge, right? So here's like an image of human population just after World War II. Human population started growing, and here the extinction growing exponentially with population growth. Correlation doesn't mean causation, but anyways, there are a lot of people who's going to argue against. Come on, it's like when you look at after Second World War, like I mean, I didn't live, probably the other professors can share more about this experience, but it probably was a scary time when humans were using these atomic bombs and doing this kind of activity, right? And we had like this time of humans being so powerful, and we had all this technology, anyways, developing our appliances, and well, we are trying to improve our lifestyles, right? At the same time, like this is one of the commercials, right? Like development of this pesticide. This is the one from DDT, and it's kind.
DDT. It spells certain death to all insects I've mentioned so far, and others too.
There must be a catch to it. Maybe Pestroy hurts humans too.
No, sir. It harms only us, the citizens of Buckton. Used right, it is absolutely harmless to humans and animals. But to insects, it is deadly.
Anyways, and then Richard Carson was like pointing, right? Like, well, we have this goal of controlling nature, right? But she was observing and collecting all this information about the destruction that we were causing. And then, well, this is the same thing about like, there's an interesting documentary about like this DDT use against malaria in the US, but there was this big movement also to spread in Brazil because we have the yellow fever issue. And Brazil was following the same trend as like in America, there was just copying the model, right?
Less than a century ago, malaria was rampant in America. Thousands suffered its fevers and chills every year. But by the 1940s, malaria had been virtually eliminated from the United States. By draining swamps, screening windows, and spraying insecticides. This remarkable achievement was inspired in large part by the efforts of an American doctor named Fred Soper. Soper became a legend in Brazil, where he'd led a campaign against yellow fever in the 1930s. It was so successful, the Brazilian government asked him to take on the more difficult problem of malaria. Soper was not focused on treating malaria victims. His target was the particular mosquito that spread the disease most rapidly. The Anopheles gamma. Soper declares war on the Anopheles with only one goal: total eradication.
There's no such thing as partial success in species eradication. One either achieves glorious success or dismal failure.
Soper mounts a military-style campaign, dividing the country into sectors and attacking them one after the other, fumigating homes, draining swamps, and poisoning every mosquito breeding site they can find. And it works. By 1940, he had eliminated the Anopheles gambiae from Brazil and reduced malaria deaths considerably. He was so successful, many believed malaria could be controlled in other countries as well. With Fred Soper leading the way, 55 nations signed up for the Global Malaria Eradication Program in 1948. Their goal? To wipe malaria from the face of the earth by using the most powerful weapon to date, a chemical spray called DDT.
DDT revolutionized vector control. Because it was so cheap, you could apply vector control to whole countries.
Anyways, as you can see, it's like, well, they were trying to find a magical solution, right? And in the short term, it worked. But then, well, the scientific community, Carson actually, well, she was compiling about this, all these scientific studies about the effect of DDT, right? Like, she actually didn't even wanna, she was not related to this field of knowledge, right? She was just like seeing, having access to knowledge And here's like her ethical responsibility to share that knowledge, right? Like, so, yeah, she saw like there is one passage, it was really cool, really not cool, but like said about the Robin, decline, population decline, and other birds, right? And there was this bioaccumulation of these pesticides in the different trophic levels. And again, she mentioned about Charles Darwin, right? Like, so knowledge accumulates over time. Darwin, I'm gonna talk about him a little bit later, but she mentioned in one part saying that, yeah, if he was alive today, right, like would be the best example for evolution by natural selection, in which you have variation, and some of them are resistant to DDT, and then the DDT is not gonna, after you spread the DDT, this one's gonna survive, so eventually it's not gonna work anymore, and that's what happened, right? Like, so then you need to come up with another magical strategy to get rid of these insects that's annoying humans, right? Anyways, and she, as I said, right, like when I was like looking more in depth into her, she had this responsibility to share knowledge, and in the last 2 years of like her life, well, she was really sick, and first her mom was sick in the first year when she was writing. Then she got cancer, and she didn't tell anybody, right? Like breast cancer, and imagine like how much suffering she was going through. But still, she had the responsibility of sharing that knowledge, compiling that knowledge that was acquired by many scientists. The scientific community knew about the effect of DDT in many different ways, but that knowledge was not being passed through the general public, right? And she was a really good communicator and really good writer. We were discussing a little bit between the difference between Darwin and Carson. It's way more pleasant to read Carson than Darwin. Darwin for me is like, it's a really kind of hard study. But anyways, it's, she had this duty to act, right? Like, and imagine a woman in that time. They were not used to go to college, and you have this manly society, and actually the part of society that she affected was most likely like a very tiny portion, where those chemical companies were like fighting against her, right? There were a lot of criticisms. They were mentioned that she was like hysterical, communist, and so forth, right? Like, and imagine for a woman in that time, with cancer, and being able to get that strength to act, right? Like, it's really inspiring. And with those attitude and the chemical industry fighting back, right? Like, actually brought more attention to the problem, right? And from there, after her publication, ignited like this environmental movement. Anyways, in different times, right? Like, she used this accumulation of knowledge, and she used even Darwin's idea, right? Darwin's and Wallace's idea. Darwin, in his time, he also had a big challenge, right? Like, why did he take 20 years to write that book? Well, because he was really scared of facing society and saying an idea that was not like accepted by his prestigious society, right? Like, he already was a renowned naturalist. He would change the norm that like these perfect beetles, well, he was really into beetles. Perfect beetles were not designed by God. There was a struggle for survival, right? That species actually changed over time, and that the Earth was older than 6,000 of years, right? And that, well, at the end, that's his publication about the descent with modification. He didn't use evolution. He just used descent with modification, right? And it revolutionized many fields in biology. Right? So here we are, and here is the phylogeny that I showed you guys before, right? Like if was not like the evolution of knowledge, right? Like we wouldn't have a good understanding of our relationship between us and other primates, and then lemurs, and then mammals, right? Like, and all these other diversity of living things, right? And well, we have this duty to act, right? Like, and we don't need to try to go like them, right? Like, but we need to do our own local thing, right? Like actions, right? In Brazil, when you see these like hundreds of new pesticides approved in Brazil under Bolsonaro is the president of Brazil. It's really hard to stay quiet, right? Like, and then not having any political opinion. And that even Brazil, we use atrazine. That's another pesticide. Imagine that, yes, DDT was banned, but they come up with all these different solutions. In the US, is a big issue. They use largely in the corn crops. And this professor, I should be more respectful towards the professor from Berkeley. There's like interesting documentaries about him, but I started like being engaged with the environmental movement when I attended a talk from him. And he was showing the effect of this atrazine. It's a herbicide that is an endocrine disruptor that Syngenta, another big corporation, use largely in these crops in the US. And EPA knows about the effects of this herbicide, right? It's being used everywhere here, everywhere in Brazil. It's banned in Europe and cause this feminization, like the males becomes females, basically. And then yesterday actually was digging into the data of EPA. And you can find like the use of atrazine in these different areas in the US, but we have the data until 2017. They haven't updated since 2017. There's a question mark why we don't have access to EPA data after 2017. Right? And I don't want to get into this politics, but again, we need to have access to information, right? Again, that being said, like, what can we do, right? First of all, it's like, yes, we should go out. We should appreciate nature, right? And again, they inspire me, both of them. And I will give like just a very brief summary about them, right? But they had this wonderful appreciation for nature. They were trying to make the information accessible to the public, right? And they act. They even though they had to face a lot of challenges, they act, right? And again, what can we do in the pandemic? This is like now we are in this revolution of smartphones, technology, and instead of like spending your time looking at, Instagram, TikTok, right? Like there's like these other apps that this is called iNaturalist. And it connects, like, it's a social media of naturalists. Nowadays, it's harder to find those naturalists because it's not a field of biology that it's appreciated. Now it's like all about the molecular science, right? Like, and genomics. But this is a simple way for you to engage. There is artificial intelligence behind that is going to identify the species once you take the picture. But basically, it's app that it connects people like scientists, people, curators from the natural history museums that help to identify these species. And in that way, like I created, one of my classes during this pandemic, right? Like since we can't go out together, I said like, well, I'm gonna create this iNaturalist allows us to create this community. And I said like, look, you guys, I made like a protocol for them to follow and to download the app. And then it's really cool to see them exploring nature in different parts of the US, right? Like, so I have one student from Rhode Island, the other one from New Jersey. Most of them are like from PD region, right? This is a trip that they did, during the summertime. But this is like a simple app that, yes, you can start exploring and wondering about things. And yes, this is like one species that a lot of students caught, right? And probably you guys know is the spotted lanternfly, right? And which is an invasive species. And then you start like exploring the website. You start looking at the different larval stages. You start looking at this is data collected by citizen scientists, right? Like you can see that over time from 2018, 2019, 2020, the problems becoming worse, right? So it's just for the fact that you went out, you collect some data, help with the community, you can be engaged into this citizen science type of project, right? And there's way more that you can do with the design naturalist. But again, this is like just the message here, right? Like, what can we do? First, go out, explore. A lot of you guys, I know that like I was looking at the answer, how many national parks have you been, right? Like, it's one of the things that I love to do during my vacation is to go to national parks, right? And, recently I started exploring the Appalachian Trail and, Dr. Contosta, right? Like he showed the documentary about the Wissahickon. And in that way, you start like becoming curious about nature and you want to learn more about the history of that place, natural history or human history, whatever field of knowledge you're interested in, right? Like that's how you get engaged. Oh my gosh, I am taking a lot of time to go over. Anyways, that being said, that's all what I have. And thank you for your patience and let me know if you have any questions. Probably I saw a lot of messages that I couldn't keep track of.
Dr. Yamaguchi, thank you so much. There are lots of questions. We'll let students speak up and go first.
Mm-hmm.
And you can put questions in the chat now because it'll be easier, I think, for Dr. Yamaguchi to see those questions now, and I can also help field them, but also feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
I'm going to disregard my boss's direction that students speak first. And I have a question for you, Professor. What is your favorite national park? Because my daughter and I love to travel to national parks. Tell us about a national park you have visited.
The one that I think I visited most was Joshua Tree National Park. Oh my gosh, that place is magical, right? Like it's in the middle of the desert. You have like those granite formation for those Joshua trees. And I think it's hard to say that's my favorite. Like in California there, I think in California region is probably my favorite area. You have Yosemite, you have like the Sequoia and the Joshua Tree. Those are probably my three favorite in that area. But there are tons to explore, still to explore.
There are so many beautiful ones. I remember visiting with my daughter Mount Desert and also up in Alaska, Denali. And also when we went Olympic National Park in Washington on the coast. And when we went to Big Sur on the central California coast, she asked me, "Is this a national park?" And I said, "No, these are state parks." And she said, "It should be." and I said, "You're right." But we're so lucky to have these beautiful state and national parks to visit.
Definitely. Like one of the things that it's very contradictory, right? Like in the US, there's so many damage, but like the infrastructure in these national parks are so nice. It's like I remember my parents came from Brazil for my graduation at UCLA, and we took like a road trip to Zion National Park to and I think we briefly visited Bryce, but they have the infrastructure for all ages and all type of people. It's really cool. So there's one question here. How can scientists predict the next stage in human evolution? If so, what's next? Superpowers, superintelligence? Ooh, that's interesting questions. Like, can we predict evolution? And I'm gonna basically think about a few examples, like one major example, right? We are still evolving, or we think that we are not anymore under natural selection. So with the development of vaccines, for instance, we are kind of taking softening the effect of natural selection, right? And one thing, for instance, we are trying to find the cure for malaria. We were talking about malaria, right? One thing to know is that evolution, we don't go to a better form, right? For instance, the sickle cell anemia, which is deleterious disease here in the US, right? Like, I'm not going to go into the details, but in Africa, in the regions where the incidence of malaria is high, sickle cell anemia also is, the prevalence of sickle cell anemia also is high. There is like a high correlation between sickle cell anemia and malaria. Why? Because in those conditions, there is less effect of the malaria into the body because of the shape of the hemoglobin. And in that way, there is a heterozygote advantage. I don't want to like to use those words here, but anyways, there is a, why do we have a prevalence of sickle cell anemia in those regions? Because it gives advantage, right? Not necessarily that trait is going to be the best solution, but that's the variation that we have. And under malaria condition, having sickle cell anemia actually can be good, right? But then you ask if we're gonna be, if there's selection for human intelligence. It's, are we doing artificial selection, right? Like in humans, are we selecting some traits? It's a question that I don't feel comfortable, because there is like a lot of things to put into perspective, like where you're born, right? Like you have the nurture aspect that mixes with your genes, right? And it's really hard to disentangle these two things. So do we have any direction to go? Can we predict? I am not God to to try to go towards that direction. CRISPR gene editing, right? Like we are, we, the thing is that like there are a lot of ethical issues, right? Like of playing and editing your genes. You're selecting for certain things for future generation that they didn't even have a choice, right? Like, so you are making editing your genes that the next generation, like, why did they do this to me? We cannot even like solve this COVID issue, and we are like trying to find other solutions. And anyways, it's humans and the organisms are so complex that it's not easy to find a single solution for all our problems, right? Anyways,
I have a question. So is evolution different from human changes? For example, a student wrote about how in his little weekly assignment that we are much taller than we were a few centuries ago. And my response, which may have been incorrect, is that that is a change we see, but it has to do with our intervention, our nutrition, and so on. That is not the same as evolution. And similarly, I think, you know, there's a lot of science right now about hearing loss. We are losing our hearing at a greater rate than we used to, but that isn't, it's not a good thing. It's also not evolution, right? Is that true?
how do we
Did I
define
say that
evolution,
right?
right? So we make evolution as one complicated thing, right? Like, and evolution is a simple definition. Descent with modification. So the next generation, for instance, like in the horns of cows, right? Like if you select there's two components, right? Like you have for sure the mental aspect. That's like if you eat better, you're gonna have larger horns, or like you can be taller. But yes, there is the genetic effect, and we tend to try to get one single gene leads to a certain single trait, right? And in general, yes, the population of humans start getting taller, right? And then the question mark, is it considered evolution? Yes, definitely. It's like you had a change over time, basically, right? Like it's a change that, yes, it's heritable. And if it's heritable, so first you have variation. And if it's pushing towards the mean, towards one direction, yes, there was a change. Is it good, bad? Who knows, right? Like, and I just want to give, I feel a little bit uncomfortable when we talk about human evolution because it involves a lot of different fields. But that's why we are here, right? Like in an interdisciplinary community, right? But about the Darwin finches, there was a couple from the Princeton University, Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant. Probably they lived on the island they have been visiting the island for more than 40 years. And that time when malaria and all these resistance to insecticide start like happening, right? They didn't know exactly how much time evolution takes, right? Like to happen. And then they started like seeing this artificial selection, right? Like putting DDT, that evolution, the changes in the allele frequency or the change of morphology can happen really quickly, right? So if you look at those Darwin finches, this couple was really cool to follow their life. And in, I think it was 1976, 1977, they were collecting data on the Darwin finches peak. And suddenly there was the El Nino, there was the environmental changes. And then the next time when they went back, they saw a lot of mortality there, right? Like a lot of those birds that they were tracking, the population declined, and then they started measuring the beaks. So from that time, they saw that actually there was a selection towards larger beaks and smaller beaks because the mid-size seeds disappeared, right? Like, so there were like just two types of seeds available. And from there, they detected that there was a difference in beak size. So the question mark, is evolution happening? Not yet, right? Like they need to pass that trait to the next generation. And they passed to the next generation. And therefore they confirm with another evidence that yes, evolution happened.
Hilton, could I ask a question?
Sure.
Darwin talked a lot about sexual selection. And I'm wondering if, for some reason, there's a tendency to be attracted to certain physical characteristics in the opposite sex, like tallness, for example, or eye shape, for example. Could that propel human evolution?
Definitely. We select for certain traits, right? Like we are considered like primates. I'm very careful when I talk to different public because in general I had a lot of different reactions. But yeah, sexual selection is one type of natural selection, right? Like, so you are trying to choose in a very simple way. Females are choosy, right? Like because it's expensive to produce eggs, and the males produce sperms in a very cheap way. So there is a sexual selection for like finding a better mate, right? So it happens in humans, but again, when we talk about fitness, it depends on the environment where you are at, right? So maybe this is just a speculation, right? In Africa, for instance, if you have sickle cell anemia, and that's like predicting maybe if they have a higher chance of survival, maybe in the future, right, like the trait is becoming more appealing to sexual selection, right? But I'm just saying that's like, yes, you can have sexual selection towards different traits, but depends on the environment that you are at, right? Like it can be really dynamic. There's not like a clear cut saying we are going towards that direction, right?
And I think it's often unconscious, the attraction.
Definitely.
Unconscious.
And can I just add one thing about like birds, for instance, right? Like they have these beautiful ornaments, especially the males, right? To attract mate. Like if they have a longer tail, they can be more attracted to mates. And it's a honest signal for the females to choose good fitness, right? But the things that like you look at the peacock, how it's like that was one of the Darwin's like puzzles, right? Like how these things evolve because it's going to attract predator, right? So at the same time that it yes, it's a honest signal, but it gets to a trade-off that like it gets to a certain point that's not beneficial anymore, right? So it's a trade-off between showing your fitness and survive, right? And probably it works as humans, but we have so many other variables like culture evolution and all these social aspects that's really hard to disentangle.
I agree, sir, for what little it's worth, that it's all about reproductive success,
right,
and having successful children. My question to you is there such a thing as biological memory? Can I pass my experiences on to my children through my genetic makeup and not just through teaching them?
So Lamarck would say yes, I think, right?
Lamarck is probably the person that would. The interesting thing is that, like, I'm careful when I answer this question because now there is a big movement of epigenetics. Right? You need to have that into your genes to pass to the next generation. But this idea of passing experience through just like within your generation, it's not possible, right? But there are like certain things that's like depends on the things that like there's a lot of fields in biology that they try to go back and challenge the status quo, right? And there's like this gene expression, so it depends on how like there is this maternal effect, right? Like depends on how the egg was taken care of. The next generation can be influenced by just nurture, right? So it's a field that's like still under development, but I would say right now, no way that your experience can be passed on to the next generation without you just telling them.
And the corollary seems to be that whatever it means, my genes are my genes, and I can't change them.
So far, yes, but with biotechnology, we might be able to. And again, it's like it needs to be in the your reproductive area, right? Like that needs to be changed to pass on to the next generation.
Yeah, although I think people in sexual selection will select out certain characteristics in a mate, wanting to pass those on to his or her offspring.
We have a question from a student, Chloe Youngblood, about recessive traits and dominant traits in the chat.
So innovation are combined with the mutation of the genetic structure. Like the more recessive trait could become more dominant than dominant traits. So this is the Mendelian Mendelian genetics that we talked about a lot, right? Like, so you have these alleles in general, you have the codominant ones that you have no dominance over the other. Then you have the recessive one and the dominant one, right? And that's how we learn genetics from the beginning. But now, imagine that like humans, we have 3 billions of sequences, right? Like about 20,000 of genes interacting with each other. And there are very few traits that you have one gene, one phenotype. So it's interaction of many of these genes that act in cascades and in a network that becomes a really challenging task to understand, like if one is recessive or dominant, right? Like this is the Mendelian genetics that really helped us to understand how traits pass on to the next generation. But again, it's when you have a combination of all these 3 billions of sequences like interacting, right? It becomes really challenging to make these clear-cut cases, right? So, yes, you have like mutations, and these mutations in general can be neutral. Mostly, if it's not neutral, can be deleterious or positive. In general, Darwin was out of the game for a while because imagine that like you open your computer, you have a bunch of wires, and that's basically a simple explanation of how it would work. And randomly you go and pull a wire. To make a change that's going to be positive is very low, right? So, yes, mutation appears over millions of years, right? Or like even short time span. But at the end, it's really hard to predict. It depends on the environment that they live in. It's going to be beneficial, neutral, or deleterious, right? And if even in more conservative regions of the genome, for instance, like defined limbs, right? Like the homeotic genes, right? Over there, if you have a mutation, in general, it's deleterious. Rarely is going to give benefit. Okay.
There was an earlier question about DDT was it DDT that was just purely so dangerous to the ecosystem, or was it the volume? So I guess it's kind of a basic environmentalist question.
Well, both, right? Like, and that's the thing. It depends on the quantity. So I think what Rachel Carson was trying to do is just to have regulation, right? I'm not against pesticide, but depends on the quantity, the levels, right? Like you need to have a good understanding what's like when I was looking through the little dose for different organisms, you have different thresholds. So you need to regulate, like quantity is important, but the DDT accumulates in your body, right? And over the different trophic levels. So yes, quantity is important, but also, yes, there is a magnification effect that can accumulate in different trophic cascades. Right?
Right, in the case of DDT or some other.
Right.
There was a lot of interest early on in some question. I wasn't entirely following the discussion about chimps and gorillas.
Can I break in?
Some things out.
I'm the gorilla that started that conversation.
Okay. So I think Dr. Yamaguchi needs to explain something about evolution early on.
Well, I'm the gorilla that started that conversation, okay. And as a gorilla, I break in again, and and I wanted to ask you, sir. You speak about DDT, and I'm thinking of mosquitoes and mosquito-borne illnesses, and you mentioned your background in Brazil. Could you speak to us a bit about Zika?
The life cycle of a Zika, right? Like, so, I was like focusing towards more the gorillas things. Actually, originated like the Zika in Uganda, right? Like, was not like a new disease that was from Brazil. The outbreak was in Brazil, right? Transmitted by Anopheles, right? And the chikungunya and other disease. It's again a virus that cause mostly, I mean, they saw that cause microcephaly, right? Like, so the kids were born with a small brain. That once you have that kind of phenotype of that kid, I'm not sure if you saw those pictures with people that were infected by the Zika, right? But at the end, it's like...
And it was unclear to me whether that was caused by Zika or pesticides.
Right. And again, the things that's like, imagine in Brazil, now we have these oscillations in the data collection, right? So suddenly, again, you have this kind of phenotype appearing in certain regions, and then you have the outbreak with the Zika, right? And then suddenly they start making this correlation between both, right? And at the end, I think was very tiny percentage that actually showed this phenotype. But I didn't follow up with all the consequences of Zika. But again, could be pesticides, could be a lot of other environmental factors. But once you had the outbreak, they just go directly to this vector-borne disease, right? And of course, that the outbreak didn't go through, so the funding in the Zika research declined, and then you don't see anymore in the news. And I'm not like specializing virus at all, right? So I stopped like following too. But anyways, there's a question mark until the new outbreak comes and becomes like the new pandemic, right? So it's really hard to disentangle all these issues.
Well, it was a very unfair question, so forgive me for asking it.
Yeah, it's a hard question.
He seems to be up for it, so throw any science questions you want at Dr. Yamaguchi. Do you want to answer the chimp versus gorilla question?
What was the chimp versus gorilla question?
It was my question, sir. Okay. And the point was that my limited understanding is that humans have 99% genetic equivalence with chimpanzees, and we also have 99% equivalence with gorillas.
I see.
Personally, I identify with gorillas, and Professor Del Gizzo says she's a chimp. She's on chimp team, and that's cool. And there are also orangutans in
and bonobos.
Well, I was hoping we could build consensus on orangutans, but that's a failure. But are we more? Do you believe we're more gorilla? Do you believe we're more chimp?
So from the genetic perspective, right? Like when you build the phylogeny, there is like this parsimony kind of thing that like now we have the whole genome. So there is no doubt that we are more close related to chimps and bonobos than to the gorillas, right? So once you build that phylogeny, it's really solid and clear cut, right? Like there's a lot of validation to that process. And then of course that like from the phenotypic perspective, right? Like we look like more gorillas than chimps or whatever you think. And it's really interesting to look at animal behavior, right? Like, and I time to time look at chimps' behavior, and I remember looking at some studies showing that actually chimps, until we are like babies are 2 years old, they have exactly the same kind of behavior, right? So there are a lot of similarities, but then that 1% leads to these differences in the phenotype, right? But genetically, we are more close to chimps than to gorillas. And again, when I say 99%, they're like also the number of chromosomes are different between the two different species, and there are a lot of I'm just simplifying the whole thing, right? Like there are more genetic differences than just like the sequence that we talk, right?
My thought was that, and again, I think that there are biological and sociological aspects to anthropology, and my thought or my feeling is that what I dislike in chimps it is aggression, is war, is gangs of chimps warring on other gangs of chimps and doing horrible things to them. And when I identify with gorillas, what I mean to say is I'm a peaceful animal who just wants to eat bananas. And if someone bothers me, I will mock, or maybe I will full charge them. So it seems to me, maybe I have to accept your statement that we are genetically closer to chimps, but I wish we were closer to gorillas, because I think gorilla aggression is proper, and chimp aggression helps explain why our world is so messed up.
It's true, and it's like a fascinating question, right? Because that's when you talk about cultural evolution and like what are the characteristics that define us as humans, right? First, they thought that was tools, right? Like, but the gorillas, chimps, they use tools, and the macaque is like there's a even paper showing that well there is culture evolution of them breaking nuts, right? Like and passing that learning through multiple generations. So if it was not tools, so what led us to be different than the other ones, right? Like, and then they start looking at like why Neanderthals, they disappear from Earth. Why suddenly about 40,000 of years ago, right? Like they suddenly disappear. And one of the ideas from what I remember from the back of my head, right, like was that they were not able to have abstract thinking. So the societies that they were able to build was not larger than 100 people, because abstract thinking, for instance, you look at stop sign, everybody knows that you need to follow that stop sign, right? And in the Neanderthal, I mean, this is like probably is gonna be hard to prove because they are extinct, right? But the ornaments, like, so do they have these ornaments like earrings, right? Like symbolic meaning that you could use to recognize this abstract thinking, right? No, but most likely is one of those traits that made us to live as a society and having agreement on certain things, right? And collaborate. I know that we have a lot of wars, a lot of issues, but now we are using, for instance, the internet, thinking that like, yes, we need to get in the same time, and then we are like having a chat here, and we have an agreement between all of us virtually, right? Like sending emails. This is like a level of abstraction that I don't know if like other groups of animals they do have, right? And then the same question, right? Like even between humans, there's like this book from Gerald Diamond, right? Like why these Western societies are more civilized than those tribes like in the Amazon or in Borneo or those regions, right? And that might be related also to resources, right? Like, anyways, just like an open-ended like questions that can go to many directions.
It is a wicked question, as Dr. McCarthy reminds us. But you know, it's interesting what you say. I've heard the theory that you speak of with respect to Neanderthals, and I would say two things. Number one, I would say Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers, and they worshipped bears. And number two, I would say thinking abstractly isn't necessarily a good thing. That I would hate to think that we are selecting for ugly aggression. And that the reason that Neanderthals and gorillas fail is because we select for ugly team-based abstract aggression.
We could have also had you when we did our human nature unit, Dr. Yamaguchi, because we come up against these questions, you know, finally after we read a number of things at a certain point in the semester, we're asking, okay, so what is so different about us? And we often, you know, list a lot of things, and sometimes we might list creativity. But then somebody, of course, points out that elephants can paint. And so then we, you know, get really around and trying to figure out what is so different about us, which is in some ways kind of at the center of the whole course, really. You have given us so much to think about. I really love the lessons that you pulled out of both Carson and Darwin, that there are multiple values to nature, and that they are not only scientific, but in a kind of web of, you know, aesthetic and moral and, you know, deeply human values, that we have an ethical responsibility and then a duty to act on that shared knowledge. I think it's just a wonderful fit with the beginning of a college career and also the mission of this college, and kind of deeply embedded in the writings of those two authors. So thank you so much. This was wonderful. And you have to come do this next year again. Different group.
And it was really interesting to think in biology from this different perspective. I think it was the first time that I actually have a discussion about these differences between humans and the other primates, because for me it's very crystal clear. And it was a really interesting discussion. Thank you for this opportunity. And guys, please explore nature, get inspired out there.
We're going to, I think every Phyla class has given homework to go take a walk during fall break. So now maybe we'll add your app to it also.
Sounds good.
Thank you, sir, for joining us.